Chapter 1 Secrets. George pulled a silver house key out of the smallest pocket of a large red backpack. Mom had sewn the key in so that it wouldn't get lost, but the yarn wasn't quite long enough to reach the keyhole if the bag rested on the ground. Instead, George had to steady herself awkwardly on one foot while the backpack rested on her other knee. She wiggled the key until it clicked into place. Stumbling inside, she called out, "Hello?" No lights were on. Still, George needed to be certain the house was empty. The door of Mom's room was open, and the bed sheets were flat. Scott's room was unoccupied as well. Sure that she was alone, George went into the third bedroom, opened the closet door, and surveyed the pile of stuffed animals and assorted toys inside. They were undisturbed. Mom complained that George hadn't played with any of the toys in years and said that they should be donated to needy families. But George knew that they were needed here to guard her most prized and secret collection. Fishing beneath the teddy bears and fluffy bunnies, George felt for a flat denim bag. Once she had it in hand, she ran to the bathroom, shut the door, and turned the lock. Clutching the bag in tightly wrapped arms, George slid to the ground. As she tipped the denim bag on its side, the silky, slippery pages of a dozen magazines fell out onto the tiled bathroom floor. Covers promised how to have perfect skin, 12 fresh summer haircuts, how to tell a hottie you like him, and wild winter wardrobes. George was only a few years younger than the girl smiling at her from the glossy pages. She thought of them as her friends. George picked up an issue from last April that she had looked through countless times before. She browsed the busy pages with a crisp flip, flip, flip that stirred up the faint smell of paper. She paused on a photo of 4 girls at the beach. They modeled swimsuits in a line, each striking a pose. A guide on the right-hand side of the page recommended various styles based on body type. The bodies looked the same to George. They were all girls' bodies. On the next page, 2 girls sat laughing on a blanket, their arms around each other's shoulders. One wore a striped bikini. The other wore a polka dot one piece with cutouts at the hips. If George were there, she would fit in right away. Giggling and linking her arms in theirs, she would wear a bright pink bikini, and she would have long hair that her new friends would love to braid. They would ask her name, and she would tell them, "My name is Melissa." Melissa was the name she called herself in the mirror when no one was watching, and she could flat reddish brush her flat reddish brown hair to the front of her head, as if she had bangs. George flipped past flashy ads for book bag organizers, nail polish, the latest phones, and even tampons. She skipped over an article on how to make your own bracelets and another on advice for talking to boys. George's magazine collection had started by accident. 2 summers ago, she had noticed an old issue of Girl's Life in the recycling bin at the library. The word girl had caught her eye instantly, and she had slipped the magazine into her jacket to look at later. Another girls' magazine soon followed, this time rescued from the trash can down the block from her house. The very next weekend, she had found the denim bag at a yard sale for a quarter. It was just the size of a magazine, and it had a zipper along the top. It was as if the universe had wanted her to be able to store her collection safely. George settled on a 2-page spread about framing your face with makeup. George had never worn makeup, but she pored over the range of colors on the left side of the page. Her heart raced in her chest. She wondered what it would feel like to really wear lipstick. George loved to put on chapstick. She used it all winter, whether her lips were really chapped or not. And every spring, she hid the tube from Mom and wore it until it ran out. George jumped when she heard a clatter outside. She looked out the window to the front door directly below. No one was in sight, but Scott's bike lay in the driveway, the back wheel still spinning. Scott's bike. That meant Scott. Scott was George's older brother, a high school freshman. The hair on George's neck stood up. Soon, heavy footsteps climbed up the stairs to the second floor. The locked bathroom door rattled. It was as if Scott were rattling George's heart inside her ribcage. Bang, bang, bang. You in there, George? Yeah. The shiny magazines were spread across the tile floor. She gathered them into a pile and stuffed them into the denim bag. Her heart was thumping almost as loudly as Scott's foot against the door. Yo, bro, I gotta go, Scott yelled from the far side. George zipped up the bag as quietly as she could and looked for a place to stash it. She couldn't walk out with it. Scott would want to know what was inside. The bathroom's one cabinet was stuffed with towels and didn't shut all the way. No good either. Finally, she hung the bag from the shower head and closed the curtain, desperately hoping that this wouldn't be the moment Scott discovered personal hygiene. Scott rushed in as soon as George opened the door, unzipping his jeans before he reached the toilet. George exited quickly, closed the door, and leaned on the wall outside to catch her breath. The bag was probably still swinging in the shower. George hoped it wouldn't hit against the curtain, or worse, fall and land in the bathtub with a thud. George didn't want to be standing near the bathroom when Scott came out, so she went down to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of orange juice and sat at the table, her skin tingling. Outside, a cloud passed overhead and the room grew darker. When the bathroom door banged open, George jumped in her seat, splashing juice on her hand. She realized she had been barely breathing. Thump, 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 thump. Scott tromped downstairs, a DVD case in his hand. He opened the refrigerator door, pulled out the carton of orange juice, and took a long swig. He wore a thin black t-shirt and jeans with a small hole on the knee. He hadn't gotten a haircut in months, and his dark brown curls formed a mop on his head. Sorry if I busted in on you while you were taking a dump. Scott wiped the juice off his lips with his bare forearm. I wasn't taking a dump, George said. Then what took you so long? George hesitated. Oh, I know, Scott said. I bet you had a magazine in there. George froze, her mouth half open and her brain mid-thought. The air felt warm and her mind swirled. She put her hands on the table to make sure she was still there. That's it, Scott grinned, oblivious to George's panic. That's my little bro, growing up and looking at dirty magazines. Oh, George said out loud. She knew what dirty magazines were. She almost laughed. The girls in the magazines she was looking at wore a lot more clothes than that, even the ones at the beach. George relaxed, at least a little. Don't worry, George, I won't tell Mom. Anyways, I'm heading back out. Just had to get this. Scott shook the plastic box he held in his hand, and the DVD inside rattled. Haven't seen it yet, but it's supposed to be a classic. It's German. The title means something like The Blood of Evil. When zombies gnaw this one guy's arm off and kill him, this other guy has to use the gnawed off arm of his dead best friend to fight the zombies. It's awesome. It sounds gross, George said. It is, Scott nodded enthusiastically. He took another gulp of orange juice, put the carton back into the fridge, and headed for the door. I'll let you get back to thinking about girls, Scott joked on the way out. George dashed up to the bathroom, rescued her bag, and buried it deep inside her closet under the toys and stuffed animals. She put a pile of dirty clothes on top, just in case. Then she closed the door and collapsed face first onto her bed, her hands crossed over her head, pressing her elbows to her ears and wishing she were someone else, anyone else. Chapter 2. Charlotte Dies. Miss Udall leaned against her giant desk, reading to her fourth grade class from a tattered copy of Charlotte Webb by E.B. White. She wore her shiny black hair in a loose bun, and wooden earrings dangled from her long earlobes. In her seat by the window, George couldn't listen. She couldn't think. Charlotte, the wonderful, kind spider, was gone, and nothing was good. The whole book was about Charlotte saving the rump pig Wilbur, and then she goes and dies? It wasn't fair. George pushed her fists into her eyes, rubbing until rows and rows of tiny triangles twirled and twinkled brightly in the darkness. A tear dropped onto George's book and spread into the spider web on the page. She breathed in carefully, trying not to make a sound. Shallow breath followed. Shallow breath until she was dizzy. She inhaled deeply, and as she did, she sniffled loudly. George heard whispers in the quiet room. Some girl is crying over a dead spider. That ain't no girl, that's George. Close enough, followed by laughter. George didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what she would see. Rick sat 2 rows over from George, and Jeff sat behind Rick. Jeff would be leaning forward in his seat with his spiky hair nearly on Rick's shoulder. Rick would be leaning back in his shiny black baseball jacket. They both would be holding their hands to their mouth, half-heartedly trying to keep quiet. Once, George and Rick had been friends, or at least friendly. In 2nd grade, there had been a class checkers tournament, and George and Rick had been the best 2 players. The final match of the competition had been close, with Rick barely winning after he'd been able to king his final piece. Even though George had lost, the 2 had still called each other checker champs for weeks. In the 3rd grade, Jeff joined the class. Jeff had moved from California and was not happy about it. He started a few fistfights and threatened most of the boys at first, including George. But Jeff settled in by October, and once Jeff and Rick became buddies, Rick wasn't so friendly with George anymore. By winter break, Jeff and Rick were inseparable, and now it was as if the checker champs were 2 kids who had known each other once, but had never met either George or Rick. Miss Udell glared at the snickering boys, cleared her throat, and read the final paragraph of the chapter. Her students were old enough that she rarely read to them aloud, but today she wanted them to be able to focus on what she called the magnificent melancholy of Charlotte's final moments. When she was finished, Miss Udell closed the book, placed it on top of a pile of papers on her desk, and removed her glasses. I'd like all of you to take out your journals and spend a few moments with your reactions to this chapter. You may take a moment to reflect, but then get your pencils moving. I want you to dig deep and use some feeling words. Room 205 was filled with the sounds of journals being removed from desks, pages being turned, and pencils being searched for. Mrs. Udell walked down the aisle towards Jeff and Rick and spoke to them privately. Her voice blended in with the noise of the room, so George could barely hear her, even though she was only 2 seats away. Some of us take death very seriously. Mrs. Udell's words were icy. She looked at Jeff and Rick in turn. They stared at their sneakers. It's a solemn topic, and I hope that you will respect yourselves, your classmates, and life itself by treating it as such. Jeff and Rick mumbled apologies. George wasn't sure whether their half-hearted sorries were meant for her, Miss Udell, or Charlotte. She wasn't sure she cared. That moment, Miss Udell turned away. Jeff rolled his eyes. Jeff was always rolling his eyes at something, usually with a snide comment to match. Miss Udell passed George's desk. To be honest, I'm not sure what I think of a person who doesn't cry at the end of Charlotte's Web. You didn't, George mumbled. I did the first 3 times, and a good number of times since. Miss Udell paused, and for a moment it looked like she might tear up right then. My point is, it takes a very special person to cry over a book. It shows compassion as well as imagination. Miss Udell patted George's shoulder. Don't ever lose that, George, and I know you will turn into a fine young man. The word man hit like a pile of rocks falling on George's skull. It was 100 times worse than boy, and she couldn't breathe. She bit her lip fiercely and felt fresh tears pounding against her eyes. She put her head down on her desk and wished she was invisible. Miss Udell returned with the bathroom pass. It was a worn wooden block from kindergarten class and read boys in thick green permanent marker on one side. George flipped the block over with a hollow slap to the side facing her. So the side facing her read room 205. Miss Udell put her hand on George's shoulder, but George shook her off and stood up. She could barely see her way to the classroom door through her tear-blurred eyes, and she navigated the hallway, more from memory than sight. She stumbled, sobbing, into the bathroom. The boys' bathroom. Her lips trembled and salty tears dripped into her mouth. George hated the boys' bathroom. It was the worst room in the school. She hated the smell of pee and bleach, and she hated the blue tiles on the wall to remind you where you were, as if the urinals didn't make it obvious enough. The whole room was about being a boy, and when boys were in there, they liked to talk about what was between their legs. George tried never to use it when there were any boys inside. She never drank from the water fountains at school, even if she was thirsty. And some days she could make it through the school day without having to go once. George put her head down close to the faucet and splashed cold water over her neck until she shivered. Then she rubbed a clump of paper towels on her head. She combed strings of still wet hair with her fingers and smiled weakly at herself in the mirror. Back in the hallway, George held the hall pass loosely in her fingers and let it drag along the wall, sending vibrations up her hand. The rhythmic click echoed down the hall as the wooden block skipped over the thin strips of cement between the tiles. George opened the classroom door slowly, fearing laughter, but the students were too focused on their journals to notice her return. The topic, personal reactions, was written on the board in Miss Udell's careful print. George pulled out her journal and wrote the date and topic. By the time she had written, Charlotte is dead, journal time was over. Miss Udell didn't ask anyone to read aloud. Instead, she addressed the class. Tomorrow, the real fun begins. For now, I'm pleased to say that we are done for the day. She spoke the rhyme as if it were a short poem. Put your notebooks away, and we'll see which row is ready to get its things. By fun, Miss Udell was referring to the play version of Charlotte's Web that the 2 fourth-grade classes would perform for the younger grades. It was a school tradition that each spring, every student in the 1st through 4th grades read the same book. The 1st graders had the story read to them by their teachers, and sometimes even kindergartners participated. Every grade then did some sort of project. As the oldest students participating, the 4th graders put on a play of the book for the younger grades, as well as for the Parent-Teacher Association. Only the 5th grade wasn't involved because they needed to focus on spring tests to make sure they graduated and moved on to middle school. Miss Udell had called 4 rows of students, and the room was filled with the sounds of zippers and backpacks being dropped onto wooden desks. George's row was the last to be called, and the kids in it had their eyes trained on Mrs. Udell. Row 1. Chairs screeched across the floor. George gathered her things slowly, stalling as long as she could before joining the boys' line. She wanted as much distance from Jeff and Rick as possible. Miss Udell's class walked through the halls of the school and down to the yard. The bus kids were released as a group, while other children waited with Miss Udell to meet up with their parents, grandparents, or babysitters. George headed to her bus line. "George, wait up!" a voice called from behind her. Kelly, George's best friend, wore her hair in braids and smelled like oranges and pencil shavings. She wore a t-shirt that read, 99% genius, 1% chocolate. "My dad said you could come over this weekend to practice," she said as soon as she got to George. She had been chatting about auditions all week. "You still want to be in the play together, right?" George did not want to be in the play more than anything. George did want to be in the play. My apologies. More than anything. But she didn't want to be some smelly pig. She wanted to be Charlotte, the kind and wise spider, even if it was a girl's part. Her mouth was open, but she couldn't speak. Kelly held up her hand, palms in front of George's eyes. "I am Kelly, the all-wonderful and the all-knowing," she intoned. "I can sense that you are not well. Now, my child, what seems to be your problem?" She closed her eyes and slowly brought her hands to the side of George's head, peeking just a little bit to make sure she didn't poke her best friend in the eye. "If you're all-knowing, then don't you already know?" George asked. Kelly opened her eyes long enough to cross them so that they pointed at her nose. Then she fluttered her eyelids shut. "Fine. I am Kelly, the all-wonderful and mostly knowing. I will try to sense your problem." She opened her eyes again and dropped her hands. "I know. You've got stage fright. I know all about stage fright. My Uncle Bill says my dad has terrible stage fright, and that's why he lets other people get rich from performing his songs." "That's not stage fright." "Okay, maybe not. But maybe not. I don't think my dad has stage fright either. He's just a different kind of artist." Kelly shook George's shoulder. "But then what is it?" "You know I can't handle suspense. Tell me or you'll what?" Kelly's eyes gleamed with inspiration. "Or I'll bring out my army of beasts to attack you in the night and suck out your brain with a crazy straw and make you one of my minions so you have to do everything I say, including telling me what you're thinking about. What is it? What is it? What is it?" George looked around to make sure no one else could hear. Okay, calm down. Here's the thing. I don't really want to be Wilbur in the play," she told Kelly. "Oh, that's not a problem. There are lots of other parts in the play. They're called supporting roles. My dad says the best star performers would be nothing without an excellent supporting cast. Let's tell Miss Udell, let Miss Udell hear you and decide what part you should have." "I don't want just any part," said George. "Well, who do you want to be? Templeton the rat?" George shook her head. "Avery?" Kelly guessed. "Mr. Zuckerman?" George shook her head. "Who else is there?" Kelly asked. "I want to be Charlotte," George whispered. Kelly shrugged. "That's cool. If you want to be Charlotte, you should try out for Charlotte. You make such a big deal out of everything. Who cares if you're not really a girl?" George's stomach dropped. She cared. Tons. On the street, one of the buses started its engine. "I gotta go." Kelly broke into a run. "1, 2, 3, she called behind her. "Zoot," replied George. Back in the first grade, Kelly and George had decided that saying 1, 2, 3, zoot was a lot more fun than saying goodbye. They had heard it on a cartoon, and it had made them laugh all day. Neither of them could remember anymore what show it was from, and sometimes it seemed silly to still be saying 1, 2, 3, zoot, but neither wanted to be the first one to stop. That night, George dreamed she was on stage as Charlotte. She wore all black with extra limbs running down her sides. She recited the most beautiful words for the entire auditorium to hear. Her first line was delivered perfectly, as was the second. But then there was a strange noise overhead. George looked up, but all she could see was the heavy stage curtain, which enveloped her in a stuffy darkness before knocking her off the ladder. Then she was falling, and she couldn't breathe for what felt like a very long time. George woke up in a sweat. It took a moment to realize she was awake, in her bed, and not suffocating. Her bedsheet was twisted around her legs. Still, she couldn't shake the image of being Charlotte. As she ate her cereal and milk, as she dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, as she brushed her teeth, she pictured herself greeting the audience with a fine salutations. She should be the one to declare Wilbur terrific, and she should be the one to make people cry with her final farewell. Thank you for joining me for Melissa. I'm loving reading this with you. I will see you next time where we will read chapters 3 and 4. Be good to each other, be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time. I love you. Bye.